This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Derry Fitzgerald. I'm a retired member of the Defence Forces. I have served in Lebanon, Damascus, Syria overall, and Israel. And it's my great pleasure to be here today to talk about an area that I know reasonably well. We have a situation where the Abraham Accords probably set a number of opportunities for the Gulf states in place. We've had the situation, of course, in Gaza and the continuing war and everything that goes with it. And then we had situations of Hezbollah in Lebanon changing the whole political balance in that country. We've had Assad's removal in Syria. We've also had bombings that have taken place in Saudi, in Qatar. And this part of the world has been forever changing. And of course, we're all aware of the proposal that's there on the table for the current peace plan in Gaza. And we're all aware of the recent bombings that took place in Qatar and what it means for the whole region. But we're very fortunate that we're here today with a well-known expert in the area, Dr. Hellyer. And if you would just permit me, I want to read out some of the qualifications for your presence here today, if you like. You're very highly regarded. Dr. Hellyer is a senior associate fellow with expertise in geopolitics and Middle East studies at the RUSI, which is the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. He is also a senior fellow of geopolitics and senior studies and security studies at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. And that followed senior tenures in Washington with the Brookings Institute, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Atlantic Council. Dr. Hellyer has advised the US government on radicalisation and extremism in Europe and is regularly called upon by the public and the private sectors for non-partisan expertise and a frequent media commentator. He has provided analysis for the CNN, BBC, Washington Post, and the New York Times. Dr. Hellyer has also held appointments at Cambridge, Harvard, Warwick, the American University in Cairo. He's the author of 10 books and hundreds of articles on politics and security in the Middle East and Europe. I have to say we're very fortunate to have you here.
Was kind enough to invite me, to be honest, but anyway, please.
Dr. Hellyer will speak for 20 minutes, and we will take questions afterwards from the floor, and also for those online. I have a tablet here which is going to pop up the questions for me. And if people are tweeting online, to use the hashtag @IIEA. I also omitted to say that as a member of the IIEA here, I'm a member of the European Security and Defence Committee and also a member of the Justice Committee for my sins. So please, Dr. Hellyer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, thank you very much. Thank you to the IIEA for this very distinguished platform and convening a discussion that situates Ireland in this ever-changing, indeed, regional and global conversation. I want to state at the outset several things. One, my qualifications are nothing compared to the dignity that you provided me for the invitation, really. I mean that very seriously. I'm very honored to be here. It was great to be back in touch with Barry and Sean. It's great to be back in Dublin. and to be back in Ireland. And this was the second thing that I want to say. Ireland, and I want to acknowledge this at the beginning of my talk, Ireland has been very clear and consistent on its positions in the region for not just a year or two or 5 or 10, but more than 40. When it comes to a lot of what I'm going to discuss. Recognition of the state of Palestine, critique of violations of international law, an insistence that legal norms remain central to international politics, and that the rules-based order is not something that we simply talk about when it comes to our enemies, but also indeed when it comes to our allies. This clarity, I think, really matters, I think is very important, and I think it's important for people to continually remind each other of its importance, and not simply for, altruistic or, virtue signaling, but because without genuine commitment to a rules-based order, the crises that we see will not only get worse, but they will multiply today and in the future. The moral capital that Ireland has is not a minor asset in today's debates. It's in a crowded international field. Moral capital is, frankly, incredibly rare, and it's one of the few currencies that cannot be simply bought or traded or imposed. It has to be earned. And I'm very, very honored to be in a capital that indeed, on these issues, has earned it. Two recent developments before I get into the sort of the fullness of my discussion today that illustrate how quickly the ground can shift. It was already mentioned that a few days ago, the American president, Donald Trump, just released a new 2021-point Gaza plan, which has sent, of course, shockwaves throughout the region. And Qatar has concluded a new defense agreement with Washington that isn't quite Article 5, but is far more serious than what came before it. And I note them briefly here to indicate that not that the details won't change, because I think that they will, but that the pattern remains that external actors continue to shape the nature of the region, including its security architecture. And with that framing, let me turn to the broader picture, which is about the regional security architecture and how the Middle East currently looks, particularly when it comes to Israel's positioning for regional dominance, and I'll go into that, the responses of its neighbors, the contemporary crises that continue to destabilize the region from Gaza and Lebanon to Yemen and Sudan, and the implications for Europe and for Ireland. When it comes to regional architecture, I've thought quite a bit about how to frame this as precisely as possible, and using theories and doctrines that have already been talked about in IR literature, international relations literature. And this is what I've come up with so far. Israel's current security doctrine for the region is rooted in a type of offensive realism. It maintains military preponderance. It preserves the right of preemption. It prevents adversaries from building equivalent capabilities. And this approach doesn't aim at regional integration. It aims at regional paramountcy. And I think this is important because we've had all of these discussions around a new Middle East, a new future for how the region looks like. The way in which this looks from Tel Aviv isn't about integration into the region. It's about crafting the region, defining the rules of the region for everybody else to follow. And they can break them at will in accordance with any assessment of security threats that they identify. And the result is a widening distance, I'd say the widest distance in many decades between Israel and its neighborhood. For states that are in immediate proximity to Israel, the policy looks less and less like security and more like threat to sovereignty, threat of complicity in the devastation of Gaza and the genocide, and the threats of an order designed around Israeli priorities. And I think that that goes further beyond the neighboring countries. I think that what you've seen in the Gulf, and I want to move on to the Gulf, is also a concern in this regard. So I want to go through some of the sort of main geographical areas first and then go into further details. Beginning with the Gulf. The Gulf monarchies have been hedging when it comes to security architecture now, ever since the Obama administration. It's not new, but I think it intensifies. I think it's a trend that has picked up steam and developed over the years. Again, beginning with Obama in particular, but really taking root over the last few years. And you see signals around it quite often. You saw this with the Saudis just a few weeks ago when it came to the announcement of the military cooperation agreement with Pakistan. And you'll see more of that. It's not so that they displace America's relationship with them. It's rather they simply don't trust that America's relationship can provide that guaranteed security backstop indefinitely or even completely right now. And I think after Israel's strike on Qatar earlier in September, they've only been reinforced in this regard. Qatar, you have to remember, is a major non-NATO ally. That's the official designation in the United States. It's home to the largest American base in the region. It has very, very good ties with the United States. And the United States did not stop its own ally, i.e. Israel, from striking Qatar. So I think it brought certain things home. The response of the Qataris was very interesting. It was actually to deepen the security cooperation and agreement with the United States. But I don't think that they really believe that this is something that could prevent all sorts of attacks in the future or anything like that. I think that there's a recognition in the region that the United States isn't the dependable security partner that they once thought it was. And by the way, they're not unique in this regard, because I think within Europe, for very different reasons, obviously relating to Russia and Ukraine, they've come to the same conclusion. The major difference is what they do in between, i.e., when it comes to the Europeans, they are thinking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how can we gear up our defense capacity in order to make sure that we don't have to rely on the United States? And what do we do in between now and then? When it comes to the Gulf and the Arab world more generally, there isn't something equivalent to the European Union that can serve as a vehicle for having those multilateral discussions quite regularly. It could be, but there isn't. So that represents, I think, quite a challenge for the Gulf. There were far more, I'd say, harsh differences within the Gulf about normalization with the state of Israel. Those have essentially evaporated. I don't think that anybody is really expecting now Saudi Arabia to normalize with the state of Israel, not now or for the near future, and certainly not beyond within the Gulf or the Arab world more generally, but we can talk about that in questions and answers perhaps. On the other side of the Gulf is Iran. Iran is in the weakest position I think it's been in for many, many years. It really harmed relations with the Gulf by the strike on Qatar. It's lost its main ally in the Arab world, i.e. the Assad regime. Hezbollah has taken a massive hammering as a result of Israeli strikes over the past 2 years. So it's down. I don't think it's out. I think that the Iranians continue to wield quite a bit of influence over militias in Iraq. The Houthis are not an Iranian proxy, but they are certainly aligned with Tehran and derive benefit from that relationship. They will continue to be difficult when it comes to Yemen, but it's not remotely the same picture as you might have seen a few years ago with regards to Iran's actual influence in the region. Having said that, it will compensate, and I think it's already compensating for its conventional weakness with asymmetric means, with different types of proxies, drones, and so on. They're going to try to be as difficult as possible in order to maintain some sort of influence in the region, but they are really in a very very weak position, as was made very clear considering how easy it was for the Israelis to assassinate people within Iran, not just over the summer, but also Ismail Haniyeh when he visited Tehran last year. And of course, the major attack during the Israel-Iran war. Turkey's on the other side of the region. Turkey has a very interesting position. It's a NATO ally. At the same time, it engages quite a lot with Russia at a time when the rest of NATO is incredibly clear about the Russian threat. It's a regional power, and it gained tremendously from the fall of the Assad regime. It is the main winner with regards to regional powers when it comes to Syria. So it operates in a very interesting position, one that's quite unique, I think, within the Middle East. It has very good ties with Washington. It has good ties with the Trump administration and has leveraged those ties, particularly when it comes to Syria. It hasn't been able to do so when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Now, these are the main sort of, I'd say power blocks that I wanted to get into when it came to the region right now. I wanted to discuss briefly the different conflict zones, just in preparation for what I think will be an interesting discussion. I don't know what else there is to say about Gaza. Gaza is the most difficult crisis that I've studied in my 20 years in this sort of work. And it's difficult because of the scale of devastation, but also the extent to which you've seen such incredible feet dragging from the international community, particularly in the United States and the West, in stopping it. And I think, contrary to Russia-Ukraine, where, of course, Russia is an adversary, Russia is not an ally of any country in the West. Maybe Hungary, that might be unkind. But it's not an ally of Washington or of London or of Dublin or Brussels. It's an adversary. So it's not surprising that they wouldn't necessarily listen. When it comes to Tel Aviv, that's very different. The Israelis have about 70% of their arms from the United States, about 30%, maybe a little bit less from Germany, and then the rest is a smattering from other places. But you're talking 99% of arms being provided by those two countries. Neither the United States nor the European Union need to actually engage in any type of offensive, punitive actions with regards to the Israelis to get them to stop. They simply need to say, we won't do this anymore. We won't supply this. We won't support you at the UN. We won't, as in just withdrawing support as opposed to anything offensive. And I think that the war would have stopped within a week. But what we've seen instead has been enabling over the past 2 years, particularly from the US, and incredible foot dragging when it comes to the European Union. It's a humanitarian catastrophe of massive proportions. It's man-made. Doesn't happen by accident. I think we all know that. And it's refreshing, frankly, to be in a capital where there aren't huge debates about the scale of atrocity that is taking place. I do think that it's quite symbolic as well. I think that it has ramifications for discussions not only in a place like Ireland, but all across Western Europe, all across Europe more generally. When you look at public opinion polls on how people think about the crisis and the war, they're quite striking. And they're striking because they don't fit with a lot of how government and the political class actually talk about this issue. We can go into the plan, which I'm sure we will, but in questions and answers, I think those are details. Syria. Syria is the bright spot in a very bleak sort of picture that I'm painting and will paint for you this morning, because it represents the end of probably one or either the top or the second most brutal regime in the Arab world during my lifetime. So I'm not unhappy to see the Assad regime go. Also, it's not just the Assad regime of Bashar al-Assad, it's also decades of Ba'ath Party rule in Syria, which again, I think is incredibly significant. I think it's also fascinating on a very geeky sort of academic point of view, because you had somebody who went from being aligned with Al-Qaeda to essentially becoming a statesman that wants to be a part of the international order. This is real, by the way. He's not faking it, but it's fascinating to see how this has happened, and what that means for the development of political Islamism in that part of the world. Although I think, frankly, it's unique to Syria, and unique to Syria partly because of the nature of Syrian Salafism. But as I said, this is a very geeky, nerdy kind of conversation. But if people want to get into that, we can do that too. There are definitely challenges when it comes to Syria, of course. How the new authorities engage with minority communities and engage in pluralistic government. But I think that they're heading in the right direction. And I hope that what we'll see over the coming years are continual moves in that direction. Lebanon is also heading in the right direction, but frequent challenges. Of course, both Syria and Lebanon suffer from continual Israeli strikes and occupation. And I think that derails quite a lot. Many of us thought that there was the chance for two deals over the past few months. One would have been a de-escalation deal between the Israelis and the Syrians. The Israelis haven't gone for it, but discussions are ongoing. Same thing when it came to Lebanon. Tom Barak left Beirut, said he was going to Israel to get the Israelis to sign up to a new deal, came back empty-handed. So we wait to see. Yemen, an unstable truce in a conflict still driven by external patrons. And the last crisis, one that just gets very, very little attention. And I can understand why, and I'll explain why, but it really should get much more attention, is Sudan. Sudan's humanitarian crisis is probably as bad, if not worse, than Gaza's. It's a really grotesque situation. The reason why it gets less attention than Gaza is, of course, because none of the parties in Sudan are aligned with any of the international powers. They're not aligned with Washington or any Western states, so there's not the same sort of leverage that exists. It's much more of a regional issue in that regard. The second issue, frankly, is that they're Black. The way in which, and by the way, I mean this very seriously, the way in which racism and bigotry plays into how analysis has actually been constructed over the past 2 years in particular is very blatant, incredibly transparent, not simply with Sudan, but of course with regards to Israel-Palestine. And finally, media coverage when it comes to Sudan is mediated most of all, in my opinion, through powers in the region that have vested interests in Sudan. So it's simply not the same, unfortunately, as it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue. Two more things before I go to the discussion. One is about external powers, and what external powers are, the quote-unquote great powers, are trying to do in the region. Of course, the United States is still the anchor of regional security architecture for many of these states. It is stretched, I suppose, but it has no intention of leaving. It wants to do a lot in the region, but of course, fundamentally about trade, about business, especially under Donald Trump. One of the main reasons, I think, behind this new 20-point plan is that he wants to put a line under the Gaza conflict so that he can move towards doing big business deals and trade and so on. And in fact, Syria benefited from this a lot, because I think one of the arguments that had sway over the president was that Syria could become a new trading partner, new deals, and so on. Trade, deal, deal, deal. When it comes to Russia, Russia is opportunistic. It has less of a broader strategic imperative here, but it has lost quite a bit of leverage. It had more leverage in Libya. It doesn't have that same leverage anymore. It had a lot of leverage in Syria. It's lost a lot of it, so it's trying to hold some of it. And the Syrians are willing to give them that leverage in the sense of allowing them to keep their bases, but they don't have remotely the same sort of leverage that they had under the Assad regime. Remember, the Assad regime would have fallen years ago had it not been for stabilization efforts by the Russians. And finally, China, of course. China is really quite widely engaged in the region, but on a level that doesn't really interfere politically speaking. And that's not to say that they couldn't, it's that they don't. And this is the same, I think, you see across Africa and other parts of the world, where the Chinese are certainly investing a great deal in infrastructure, in relationships, but not actually underwriting any sort of regional security architecture. They do a little bit on diplomacy, but frankly, not all that much. There was a lot of fanfare about the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, but really the main credit for that, I think, came from within the Gulf itself, particularly Oman and possibly Kuwait as well, but not so much the Chinese. That could change in the future, but it's not the case right now. Opportunities and risks, and I think this is for an Irish audience in particular, but Europe more generally. There are, I would say, four points to keep in mind. The first is that there are opportunities for diplomatic or during diplomatic openings. And what I mean by that is that you had the Iran-Saudi deal. You had the rapprochement between Qatar and the Gulf states that boycotted, blockaded Qatar. You had the rapprochement between Turkey and Egypt. You have this mood that has been going on for several years now, bringing these countries together. And also, paradoxically, the war on Gaza has also brought a lot of these countries together, recognizing not only that they have a common responsibility when it comes to Gaza, but frankly, a common adversary when it comes to Israel. And there are opportunities there, I think, for developing further initiatives in the region, building off of that. It's a possibility. The second is that as Europe itself continues to look for new sources of energy, to be able to engage more systematically, particularly with Gulf states, but also elsewhere in the region, binding, I think, the Arab world and the Middle East more generally to Europe in a way that isn't, one way and isn't predicated on, which is my third point, predicated on things like migration concerns, security concerns. And this is the third point that I wanted to raise, that the relationship between Europe and this region for quite a while now has been one of damage control, has been one of securitization, where our engagement with many of the governments in the region, especially when you talk about the Middle East, North Africa, less so, of course, in the Gulf, is really about, we're worried about brown people crossing the Mediterranean Sea and flooding Europe. This is not a great way to have a relationship. And I think that there's a much better way for Europe, especially, I think we're now 40 years after the start of the Barcelona process, to have a much better discussion. The fourth point, before I come to my closing, is about Ireland in particular. And as I tried to elaborate at the beginning of my talk, Ireland has a fairly unique position when it comes to Europe and the West, when it comes to all of these issues. I suppose the closest partner in that regard would be Spain, but Spain has also gone up and down over the decades when it comes to this. Ireland is not. Ireland, I think, has been very consistent. You've earned a great deal of moral capital in the region, and one would hope that that provides for opportunities for the region to learn from Ireland in different ways, for Ireland to contribute its expertise, particularly when it comes to things like humanitarian aid distribution, when it comes to security. I know that particularly in Lebanon, the Irish have had a long history in trying to stabilize in the south as part of the UN forces, but there's much more that can be done in that regard. And I'm not sure if Dublin is taking full advantage, in my opinion. In closing, you might have thought from my talk that my main focus is Israel-Palestine. It isn't. I actually did not take the same sort of research interest into Israel-Palestine as many others have done in my career, because I wanted to focus on regional security. It is impossible to think about regional security and, frankly, most files that are significant, even tangentially, to regional security without identifying the incredibly destabilizing impact of the Israeli government. If you want to talk about Lebanon, you have to talk about Israel. If you want to talk about Syria, you have to talk about Israel. If you want to talk about regional integration and regional security architecture, it is impossible to do so without talking about Israel, unless you want to be completely unethical and just pretend that certain things aren't happening, which I refuse to do. I think that Israel's quest for this regional paramountcy role is going to define a lot of what happens over the coming years, and will continue until one of two things changes. And I think that they will change, either with regards to security balances within the region itself changing, okay, because it relies a great deal on the weakness of regional powers, or the external actors withdrawing support, or at least minimizing it, which I think is also quite likely when it comes to the United States, but not in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And against that backdrop, where I think there are more crises on the way, again, Ireland's insistence on law, on humanitarian principle, is not peripheral. I think it's central. I think the task is to turn that moral capital into operational diplomacy, not simply here at home, but in Europe more generally, in multilateral institutions and a global debate. And I think that's where the very distinct and very welcome voice of Ireland can matter the most. Thank you very much.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.